The transport smelled like recycled fear and old hydraulic fluid, and Mara Voss sat in the middle of it with her wrists zip-tied in front of her, and her one working eye closed, counting heartbeats. 47, 48, 49. She'd been doing it since they loaded her onto the shuttle at Bremerhaven. It was either that or think about what waited on the other side of the concession wall, and she'd already spent 11 months inside a government briefing room thinking about that. Thinking hadn't helped. They hadn't even given her a window. The DAS handler, a soft-chinned man named Rius who smelled of hand sanitizer and never met her eyes, sat across from her with a tablet on his knee and a look on his face like he was delivering a package he'd been told not to open. Behind him, 2 security contractors in gray body armor watched the middle distance and said nothing. "You'll be transferred at the interchange point," Rius said, "for the 4th time. The Keth delegation will receive you at Station Myra. You'll be under their jurisdiction from that point forward." "Right," Mara said. "You understand that the department cannot guarantee your safety once you cross the boundary." "You said that one. The terms of the accession treaty are clear. You are a voluntary." "I know what I am." She opened her eye. The synthetic one, the left one, the pale gray one that didn't blink quite right, she kept closed. Old habit. People didn't like it when she looked at them with that eye. They got the feeling it was recording them. It was. "You can stop explaining it." Rius closed his mouth, looked at his tablet. Outside, the low hum of the transport changed pitch as they decelerated toward the interchange. She let herself have one more thought of it, then packed it away. 12 years ago the Keth had arrived. Not with fanfare, not with a broadcast signal or a city-leveling demonstration. Just 6-kilometer-long ships settling into geosynchronous orbit over 6 of Earth's major population centers. Perfectly spaced, perfectly silent, for 19 days. Long enough for every government on the planet to have a complete breakdown in controlled, escalating stages. Long enough for the people inside those governments to do things they'd spend the rest of their lives rationalizing. The accession treaty, called the Accord by people who still had hope, called the surrender by people who'd read it, ceded 11% of Earth's landmass to Keth, administrative authority, mostly former conflict zones. Mostly places that had been forgotten before. The wall went up around each zone, high-energy containment barriers that flickered blue-white at night, and the humans inside them became what the treaty delicately termed resident auxiliaries. Nobody talked about what that meant on the ground. The official story was negotiated integration, scientific exchange, a pathway to fuller contact once mutual understanding was established. Mara had been a military intelligence analyst for 6 years before they pulled her file for this assignment. She'd read enough intercepts to know the official story was a polite fiction maintained by people who needed to keep eating breakfast without their hands shaking. The real story was simpler. The Keth had taken what they wanted. The humans inside the zones were barter, and every 3 months the DAS forwarded a voluntary liaison into Keth jurisdiction under the terms of Article 7, a provision so buried in the treaty's appendices that most of the Parliament had never read it. Liaison, that was her title now. The transport docked with a sound like a fist hitting a desk. "Good luck," Rius said, and even he seemed to mean it a little. Station Myra had been a human facility once, she could tell by the corridor proportions, built for a 6-foot ceiling and shoulders that didn't articulate backward. The Keth had done something to it since. The lighting was wrong, amber gold and directional, throwing long shadows that pooled where walls met floors. The air tasted faintly of copper and something botanical she couldn't name. It made her teeth feel clean in an unsettling way. Her escort was a single Keth soldier, which was either an insult or a statement of supreme confidence. She decided it was probably both. The Keth were bipedal, but that was where the comfortable similarities ended. 7 feet of articulated gray-black chitin, with a torso that sat too high and arms that had an extra joint that bent the wrong way when they moved. Their faces were largely expressionless by human standards, no visible mouth in the human position, eyes set wide and faceted beneath a brow ridge that could have been carved from obsidian. But they had body language. God, they had body language. Mara had spent 3 months studying the intercept footage, and she could read this one already. Bored, slightly contemptuous, walking just fast enough to make her move quickly without running. She moved quickly, she didn't run. The corridor opened into a transfer hall, and then a pressure gate, and then she was inside the concession zone for the first time, and she made herself look at everything. The light was different immediately. The sky above the zone, she could see it through high transparent steel panels, was not quite right. Some kind of atmospheric filtering the Keth used that shifted the spectrum toward the gold end. Under it, what had been a stretch of the Rhine corridor looked post-human. The original buildings were still there, but Keth structures had grown between and among them the way coral grows around a ship's hull, organic and deliberate and strange. The streets were neither empty nor full. Humans moved through them with the particular efficiency of people who had learned exactly how much space they were allowed to take up. She noticed they didn't look at her, or at the Keth soldier. They looked straight ahead with the practiced blankness of people who had decided that was the safest direction. She was taken to a building near the zone's interior. Old construction per contact, but the entrance had been modified. Keth stonework, actual carved stone, fitted over the original facade with such precision it looked like it had always been there. A biohazard symbol, stylized into something almost heraldic, was etched into the lintel. She thought, so he makes himself a king. They took her inside. Keth Varen was not what she expected. She'd been briefed on him from intercepted communications and zone surveillance, and the accounts of 2 previous liaisons who had come back, which was rare enough that their debriefs had been read and reread at every level of the DAS. Both of them had described the Wolf King. The humans in the zone used that title, she'd learned, without irony, without contempt, with the flatness of people who had simply accepted the word for a thing, as enormous, cold, and difficult to read. Both had described a kind of overwhelming stillness in him, the stillness of something that had decided it did not need to hurry. He was in what had been an administrative conference room, repurposed now into something that resembled a throne room without quite committing to it. Functional, spare. One wall had been opened to show a view of the zone below and the gold-shifted sky beyond. He stood at it with his back to the door, the plates of his carapace catching the light in shifting planes of dark iridescence. The escort made a sound, a low harmonic, somewhere between a chord and a word, and left. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in. She chose her own position, off-center, close enough that it wasn't a retreat, not so close that it was aggression. She put her hands in her pockets. The zip ties were gone, someone had cut them between Rias and here, and she wasn't sure what that meant yet. Keth Varen turned. He was larger than the surveillance footage suggested. There was something about Keth proportions that didn't translate to 2 dimensions. The width of the thorax, the articulation of the secondary arms she could see folded at his sides, the way his head moved on its neck with that terrible, deliberate slowness of a thing that has never had a predator. His eyes, when they fixed on her, were faceted and deep amber, not warm, precise. He studied her for a long moment. She let him. "You are the 43rd, he said. His voice used a translator implant. She could see the pulse of it at his throat, but the cadence beneath the translation was his, and it was slow and weighted and utterly without performance. 43 humans the treaty has sent across my threshold." "I know," she said. "You are the first to look at the room before looking at me." She said nothing to that. Something shifted in his posture, not much, the equivalent of a raised eyebrow maybe. "What is your name?" "Mara Voss, Major, Department of Analytical Services." "They send me soldiers now." I was a soldier. Now I'm a liaison. She met his eyes without flinching, which cost her something. Those eyes did something to the old animal parts of her brain, some deep ancestral signal firing wrong that she had to consciously override. I was asked to volunteer. And you volunteered. Something like that. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he moved to a low structure that might have been a chair or a platform, and settled onto it with the quality of a mountain deciding to sit. The amber light caught the edges of his carapace and made him look briefly, impossibly, like a king in stained glass. The others, he said, they were afraid. Probably smart of them. They performed the fear. They performed deference. They performed whatever they believed I required. He paused. What are you performing? Right now, she thought about it. Calm, it's not entirely real. Another shift. That same subtle change in the set of his shoulders that she'd catalogued as something approaching interest. Why did you truly volunteer, Mara Voss? She'd thought about this answer for 11 months. She'd turned it over in the small hours of too many consecutive nights, in the briefing rooms and the barracks, and the one cafe near the Hamburg barrier, where she used to sit with a coffee she didn't taste and watch the people who hadn't been assigned to anything yet. Because 42 people went in before me, she said, and I wanted to understand what happened to them, what this place is. What you are, she held his gaze. Nobody who comes back tells the truth. I wanted to see it myself. The silence stretched. And if I kill you, he said, with the absolute evenness of someone stating a weather condition, you will have learned nothing useful. Then I'll have gambled and lost, she said. Wouldn't be my first time. They gave her a room, an actual room with a door that locked from the inside, which surprised her enough that she checked the lock 3 times before she slept. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay on the low Kethspec sleeping platform they'd furnished it with, which was harder than she would have liked and smelled of something not unpleasant but deeply foreign, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the zone at night. It was quieter than she expected. Occasional voices, human voices in several languages, the subsonic hum of the containment systems. Once, something that might have been music, distant and modal and strange. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't. The previous liaisons who came back had described a court, of sorts. Keth Varon had consolidated the zone under his direct authority within 8 months of the initial occupation, displacing 3 other Keth factions and absorbing their human populations. The methods used for that consolidation were not in any of the reports she'd read, which meant either they were buried or they were worse than anything the reports had been willing to say. The zone ran with a kind of grim functionality. Food distribution was organized. Violence was low. The humans who'd been here for years had established routines that looked almost normal from the outside. Almost. She thought about the eyes of the people she'd passed in the streets, the straight-ahead look, the practiced nothing. She thought about what it cost a person to learn that look. She thought about the 42. She fell asleep somewhere around the 3rd hour and dreamed of the wall, the containment barrier in Hamburg, the way it flickered at night, blue-white, the way the light fell on the faces of people on the other side. In the dream, her mother was there, pressing her palm flat against the energy field from the outside, not able to cross, and Mara was on the wrong side. She woke before dawn, sat up, pressed the heel of her hand to her real eye, then her synthetic one, checked the date on the chip in her wrist, day 1. She had been told the trial period was 90 days. She had her own schedule in mind. On the 2nd day she explored. Nobody stopped her. That was the first surprise. She'd expected a handler, a shadow, something. Instead, she moved through the zone with the freedom of a person who hadn't been told she couldn't, and she kept her eyes open and her mouth mostly shut. The zone had layers. The outer ring was what you saw from the limited surveillance footage available to the DAS. Functional, gray people in transit between assigned tasks. controlled, but the middle ring was different. There were workshops, actual workshops where humans were making things functional things, not just labor assignments. There were children in what looked like a school space, 24 of them sitting on repurposed office furniture while a young man with tired eyes walked them through something with a tablet. There was an open market space near what had been a park, modest and improvised, but there. People were trading, arguing, laughing in low, careful voices. They still had that look, but here it was softer. Here, occasionally, it cracked. A woman of about 60 met Mara's eye for a split second before looking away. Then she looked back. She said in German, "You're new." "Yes," Mara said. The woman glanced around with the quick professional scan of someone long accustomed to situational awareness. "From outside." "Yes." A pause, then very quietly, "Don't make trouble in the first month. They watch closely in the first month. After that," she stopped, looked past Mara's shoulder. The straight-ahead look slid back like a mask. She moved on. Mara catalogued it, filed it, kept walking. On the third day, she was brought back to Keth-Varen. He was in a different room this time, longer, lower ceilinged by Keth standards, with one wall that held what she could only describe as a map. Some kind of projection she didn't have the visual bandwidth to parse, too many layers, but the core of it was clearly a territory overlay. The zone. And she realized more than the zone. A broader region, supply routes maybe, population data. He was looking at the map when she came in. He didn't turn. "You explored," he said. "You left me free too." "I know, I wanted to see what you'd do." She came to stand beside him, not beside, a respectful angle, far enough to communicate no threat, close enough to indicate she wasn't afraid of proximity. She looked at the map. Some of it resolved into sense if she squinted and ignored the layers her perception couldn't parse. "What am I looking at?" "My problem," he said. She waited. He turned from the map finally and looked at her directly. Those amber eyes, faceted, deep. She held her ground. 3 of the zone's food synthesis nodes are running at reduced capacity. The replacement components are held in a depot outside the wall. A pause. "Outside my authority. So you can't resupply." "The other Keth faction that controls that sector." He used a word that the translator rendered as something between rivals and enemies and the formerly mine, which told her a great deal. "They require a political price I am not willing to pay." "What price?" "One I am not willing to pay," he repeated, and the weight in the repetition closed that door entirely. She looked back at the map. She said, thinking aloud, "How long before the reduced synthesis starts to affect the food supply?" A pause, 60 days perhaps, 70. "And the human population inside the zone is how large?" A longer pause. 82,400 and approximately 60. She looked at him. He was looking at the map again. She thought he knows the number. Not approximately, exactly. She filed that too. On the 7th day, she was put in the arena. She hadn't seen it coming. She'd spent a week building her read of the zone, cataloging its rhythms, learning the faces, slowly establishing that she was a person rather than an object. She'd had 2 more conversations with Keth-Varen that she'd found herself thinking about afterward more than was professionally appropriate. She'd started to believe, perhaps naively, that the 90-day trial was going to remain, if not safe, at least navigable. Then on the morning of the 7th day, 2 Keth soldiers arrived at her room before dawn and wordlessly escorted her to a structure she hadn't visited yet. A wide, circular space that had been built over what had once been some kind of public square. The architecture was entirely Keth, the tiered observation levels, the hard floor of pale, compressed stone, the carved symbols on every surface that she'd learned to recognize as the heraldic language of Keth-Varen's house. The arena. She walked in with her hands loose at her sides and her face doing nothing in particular, which was all she had. The observation levels were occupied, not packed but populated. Keth mostly in the upper tiers, and in the lower ring, pressed against a barrier that separated them from the floor, humans. Several hundred, standing quietly, watching with that schooled nothing that she was beginning to understand was not nothing at all. It was the controlled face, the safe face. Underneath it, at a pressure she could almost feel from across the space, was everything else. Keth Varen was in the upper tier still, present but remote. He was watching her. Across the arena floor, a Keth warrior she'd been told was called Telamon, the executioner. The translator rendered it, with an additional layer that meant something like the one who shows what cannot be argued was waiting. He was enormous even by Keth standards. The chitin of his arms had been scarred and re-scarred into ridged patterns that looked almost decorative until you recognized them as the map of every fight he'd survived. He carried a weapon she hadn't seen before, something between a blade and a shock staff, 2 meters of dense black composite that hummed at a frequency she felt in her back teeth. A Keth official she'd seen around the zone functionary class, she'd clocked him as a kind of administrator, spoke from the upper tier. The translator in her ear, a DAS-issue earpiece she'd been allowed to keep, rendered it. The liaison from beyond the wall faces the judgment of House Varen. If she has worth, she shows it. If she has none. The rest of the sentence wasn't really necessary. She looked at Telamon. He looked at her with the complete, still attention of something that had never once doubted the outcome of anything. She thought about the Colosseum combat training she'd done as part of close quarters certification. She thought about what she knew of Keth musculature and joint articulation. She thought about the 7 ways she'd cataloged that a Keth body moved differently from a human one, and the 3 places where that difference was a structural weakness. She thought, I have never been more afraid than I am right now. Then she thought, fine. She picked up the weapon they'd left on the floor, a short blade, human proportioned, too short for this, but hers. And she turned her synthetic eye on Telamon and set it to record, because if she died here she was at least going to give the DAS something useful, and then she walked forward. Telamon moved. He was fast. She'd expected fast. She hadn't expected how fast. He covered the distance between them in less time than she'd calculated, and the shock staff came in a horizontal arc that would have taken her head off if she hadn't dropped under it. Not gracefully, just dropped, gone down to one knee on the stone floor, and felt the displaced air of the weapon's passage across the top of her skull. She came up moving. She didn't try to engage, not yet, not directly. She put herself laterally, drawing his next strike sideways, and she watched. She needed to watch. One exchange of information, too. She needed to know how he committed his weight. The second strike came from above. She took it on the flat of her blade, and the impact drove her to her knees, and her arms went briefly numb, and she thought, very clearly, wrong. Think. The crowd was silent, not the quiet of disinterest, the quiet of held breath. She got up. Telamon paused. That pause was new. She catalogued it instantly, uncertainty, or the closest a creature like him came to it. He had hit her and she had gotten up. That was not how this usually went. She looked at him steadily with her synthetic eye, the recording eye, the one that didn't blink. He moved again, and this time she was ready for the tell she'd spotted in the way his secondary arms shifted a half-second before he committed to the strike direction. She went inside the swing. Too close for the shock staff to be effective, inside his reach, and she put her elbow into the joint of his primary arm with everything she had. There was a sound, organic, unhappy, and his grip on the weapon faltered for just one moment. She took the weapon. She didn't use it. She stepped back. She held it down at her side, not pointed at him, not threateningly, and she waited. The silence in the arena had become something different, denser. Telamon stared at her. His arm was damaged. He was still enormous, and she was still alone on a stone floor inside a Keth stronghold with 80,000 humans watching from behind a barrier. But she was holding the weapon, and she was upright, and she had not been afraid enough to stop thinking. She looked up at the observation tier. At Keth Varen. She said, loudly enough to carry. The acoustics were good, she noticed. They were always good in places built for performance. I'm not here to execute anyone. I'm not here to die for your entertainment. She turned the shock staff and drove it point first into the stone floor. Left it there. I'm here because your food synthesis nodes are failing and 82,000 people need to eat. The silence held for a long moment. Then something happened in the crowd of humans at the lower barrier. One person started to make a sound, not quite a cheer, something stranger, something that had been held for a very long time and was being carefully let out. Then another, then 10, then more. Not loud, not wild, but real and gathering. Keth Varen stood. They gave her a room with a better bed that night, which she chose to interpret as a sign. She didn't sleep any faster, but this time, staring at the ceiling, she was thinking about the food synthesis problem instead of her own survival, which felt like a promotion. She knew something about Keth manufacturing systems from the intercept files. Not enough, but the zone had resources she hadn't fully explored, and there were humans here who had been living alongside Keth technology for years and were not entirely ignorant of it. The woman in the market, the man teaching the children. The engineers she'd noticed in the maintenance sections of the outer ring. Humans working alongside Keth technicians with a careful competence that suggested they'd been doing it long enough to learn things that weren't in any DAS briefing. In the morning, Keth Varen came to her. That was different. He'd summoned her both previous times. This time he appeared at her door, which she recognized as significant without yet knowing what kind of significant. You made a speech in my arena, he said. I made a statement. There is a distinction. A speech is performance. A statement is information delivery. She studied him. The humans heard it differently than your people did. Yes. He looked at her with something that the intercept analysts had labeled inscrutable and that she was beginning to think was simply patience. He was a patient creature in a way that made human patience look like a fidget. Why did you not use the weapon? You had it. She had thought about her answer to this because she'd known it was coming. Because winning the fight and winning the room are two different things. I could have hurt Telemon maybe. I could have died trying. Either way, the statement I'd be making is that I'm a threat to be contained, and then you'd spend your attention containing me instead of talking to me. She paused. I didn't come here to win a fight. I came here to be useful. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the zone was starting its morning sounds. Someone somewhere was doing something with metal that rang at irregular intervals. The school space was probably filling up. The Keth word for what you did, he said at last. In my arena, with the weapon, there is not a good translation. The nearest is the strength that does not need to show itself. We have something like that, she said. We usually don't use it. No, he said, we have noticed. And for the first time, she thought she heard something in his voice, not quite humor, but the structural space where humor might live. The food synthesis problem took 31 days. She worked it the way she'd worked intelligence analysis, not with genius, but with the sustained application of everything she had to a problem until the problem gave something up. She learned the zone. She met the engineers, a woman named Priya who had been here since year 2 and had accumulated a frightening competence in Keth mechanical systems, and a man named Tobias who was 53 and had once designed agricultural systems, and now applied that knowledge to alien technology in ways that made her head hurt. She learned what could be sourced internally and what couldn't. She negotiated, through Keth Varen, for a DAS technical file she knew was sitting in an archive, because she'd flagged it 18 months ago as potentially relevant to Keth manufacturing, and been told it wasn't actionable. It was actionable now. She also spent time, not a lot but consistently, simply inside the zone talking to people. Not for intelligence gathering or not only, because they were there. Because they were 82,000 people who had adapted to an impossible thing with remarkable and largely unacknowledged stubbornness, and she found, after about the 15th day, that they were beginning to talk to her differently. Not much. Enough. Kethvaren observed this. She knew because she caught him watching her sometimes in the streets of the zone, in that way he had of being present without being intrusive. He was a large creature in a small space, and yet people moved around him without the particular sideways flinching she'd seen in the first days. That wasn't fear management. That was familiarity. She filed that too. On the 31st day, Priya bypassed the degraded components with a solution that was 70% human engineering and 30% repurposed Keth salvage, and the first synthesis node came back to full capacity. By day 33, all three were running. Kethvaren found her at the node station as the diagnostic readings completed. She was tired and slightly covered in whatever coolant the Keth systems used, which smelled like the botanical copper thing that still hadn't become normal to her, and she was reading the output numbers with the quiet intensity of someone who needed the numbers to be correct. They were correct. You did this, he said. Priya and Tobias did this. I found the file and argued with your administrators for 2 weeks to get the materials sourced. She looked up at him. How many of the previous liaisons did you put in the arena? A pause, all of them. How many of them made a speech? None. And before me, what was the longest any of them lasted? 12 days. She looked back at the diagnostic output. I'm on day 33. Yes, he said. She thought about what she was going to say for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said it. The 42 who didn't come back, what happened to them? The silence was long, different from his usual silences, not patience, not assessment, something more complicated. They broke, he said, not from cruelty, from the absence of what you do, what you cannot seem to stop doing. He paused, looking, assessing, acting inside the constraint rather than against it. He was looking at the diagnostic readout with her, not at her. They performed the fear and it consumed them because performance is hollow and hollow things cannot bear sustained weight. She thought about the straight-ahead look, the practiced nothing, the long cost of surviving without hope. The humans in this zone, she said, they've been here a long time. Many since the beginning. They've been managing, adapting, learning your systems, your language, she stopped, started differently. When you say you couldn't pay the political price to the other faction, the one that controls the supply depot. He turned to look at her. What would it take, she said, for me to go get what you need? Kethvaren said no. Firmly, with the complete assurance of something that had made decisions for a very long time and did not expect them questioned. She waited until the following morning and brought him a logistics brief. He said no again, but differently. The second no was the no of someone who had read the brief. She waited 2 more days. She collected Tobias and Priya and 3 other humans from the zone who had specific knowledge of the supply systems and the route, and she brought them with her to make the argument, because one human standing in front of the Wolf King making a case was an interesting diversion. But 5 humans standing in front of him with documented technical knowledge and worked examples was evidence. Kethvaren looked at them in silence for a long time. If you are captured by the other faction, he said, I cannot retrieve you. I know, she said. If you fail, I know. The political consequence of your being taken would be significant. Then we'd better not be taken. He looked at her with those amber eyes, those patient, precise, deep eyes that she had spent 49 days learning to read, and she held his gaze the same way she had on the first day, which was to say with less composure than was visible. I don't understand you, he said. It came out like a statement of fact and an admission simultaneously. You will, she said. They went in the dark, which was her call, Tobias thought morning was better for visibility. She overruled him on the grounds that the supply depot ran on a schedule, and she'd spent 3 days memorizing it. And the shift transition at hour 4 was the closest thing to a gap in coverage that their intelligence suggested existed. There were 7 of them. Her, Tobias, Priya, and 4 others from the zone who had various qualifications that translated into various types of useful. Keth Varen had provided equipment, compact, Keth spec, better than anything the DAS had ever given her, and a route brief and 2 Keth soldiers as escort to the boundary of his authority, beyond which they were on their own. She was not exactly afraid. She was something more precise than afraid, a state of heightened function that she'd been in before, twice, on operations that she still didn't entirely talk about. The fear was there underneath, where it belonged. On top of it was everything she'd ever been trained to do. They crossed the boundary at hour 2. The zone outside Keth Varen's authority was different. Not chaotic. The Keth as a species were not chaotic. Their hierarchies were rigid and layered and ancient, but colder. Less organized. The human population here was thinner, the structures more improvised, the feel of the place less like a domain being administered and more like a resource being extracted. She noticed the difference in 20 seconds, and it confirmed things she hadn't wanted to know. The supply depot was a repurposed industrial facility, 2 kilometers in. They moved carefully, using what cover the landscape offered, which wasn't much but was enough. Priya ran the signal interference package they'd built from repurposed Keth components, and for the 22 minutes it took to reach the depot, and for the 47 minutes they worked inside it, the depot's sensors saw nothing they weren't supposed to see. The critical components were where Tobias had said they'd be, based on his read of the Keth manufacturing language, and they were not even guarded beyond the passive systems, because nobody had apparently considered the possibility that humans would have the nerve to come and simply take them. She thought as they loaded the components into the carry cases, probably nobody considered it because nobody had given the humans here a reason to try. Desperation didn't produce this kind of operation. Function did. Resources did. A reason to be invested in outcomes did. She filed that somewhere she was going to do something about later. They were 4 minutes from departure when the sensor sweep recalibrated in a way Priya hadn't anticipated, and an alert sounded. "Go," Mara said very quietly. "Now, Route B, don't wait for me." "Mara," Priya started. "I said go." She met the woman's eyes for half a second. "I know the route. I'll be behind you." She stayed. She created the disturbance necessary to redirect the patrol response. Not a fight. Nothing so blunt. Just the right-wrong signal in the right-wrong place, which required her to go back into the facility and do something that was going to be extremely difficult to explain to anyone later. She got 3 significant bruises and 1 shallow cut along her left forearm and burned 6 minutes of the window she'd had, and then she ran. She caught the others at the boundary marker with 40 seconds to spare. Tobias looked at her forearm. "That looks..." "It's fine," she said. "Keep moving." They were back in the zone by dawn. Keth Varen was waiting at the boundary, which she had not expected. He was alone, which she had also not expected. Standing in the early amber-shifted light with the stillness of someone who had stood there for some time and was prepared to stand there longer. She crossed the boundary. Behind her, the others came through. Priya had the components in a secured case against her chest, held the way you hold something you've decided matters. Keth Varen looked at the case, then at Mara, at the cut on her arm, back at her face. "You went back," he said. He'd been watching the sensor data, she understood. Of course he'd been watching. "Someone had to," she said. She was tired. The tired had an honest quality to it that she'd stopped trying to manage. "You could have let the others be caught." "No," she said, "I couldn't." He was quiet. The light shifted. Somewhere in the zone, a child was calling something in German, the words not quite audible but the tone entirely normal. The tone of a child calling across a courtyard in the morning, the most ordinary sound in the world, but she heard it and something in her chest did something she was going to think about later. "Mara Voss," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" She thought about Rias in the transport, with his hand sanitizer and his tablet and his eyes that wouldn't land anywhere. She thought about the briefing rooms. She thought about 42 people who had gone in and been ground down to hollowness. She thought about 82,000 people who had learned to look straight ahead because that was how you survived when nothing asked you to be anything more. "Because someone has to," she said. "That's the whole answer. It's not a complicated answer. Someone has to look at the problem and decide they're going to work on it instead of being worked on by it, and someone has to go back when it goes wrong instead of letting other people take the consequence of their plan." She met his eyes. "The previous liaisons, you said they broke, not from cruelty, from hollow." She gestured back at the others, at Priya holding the case, at Tobias already talking to someone on comms, at the 4 others moving back into the zone with purpose. "That's the thing you couldn't synthesize by waiting. You can't send fear into a supply depot. You can't perform your way into a gap in a sensor sweep. You need people who have a reason to give a damn." Kethvaran looked at her for a very long time. 55 days, he said. "What?" "Since you crossed my threshold, 55 days. He was still looking at her with those precise amber eyes. "I have administered this zone for 9 years. In that time I have made several calculations I believed were correct that were not correct." He paused. "I calculated that the humans in my zone had reached their limit of adaptation, that they required nothing further from me than stability and administration and containment." Another pause. "I was wrong about that." She looked at him carefully. "What changed your mind?" "You showed me the school," he said. "You did not take me there. You did not tell me about it. You simply walked through that part of the zone on the 9th day, and you did not look at the school the way you looked at other things. You looked at it the way one looks at a thing that should not be surprising but is." She thought back to the 9th day. "I didn't know you were watching." "I am always watching," he said. "What I was not always doing was seeing." The light was strengthening. The zone was waking up properly now. She could hear the market starting somewhere, the first metal ring sounds from the maintenance section, the layered hum of the synthesis nodes running at full capacity. She said, "What do you want this place to be?" He blinked, the faceted eyes closing and opening, which she'd learned was not a blink in the human sense but something more deliberate, an expression, registered. "I have ruled," he said slowly, "for a very long time. I have not been asked what I wanted a thing to be. I'm asking." The silence went on long enough that she wondered if she'd pushed too far too fast. Then he said, with the careful quality of something new being moved for the first time, "I want it to be." He stopped, tried again. "I want to have been wrong about the wall." She understood what he meant. She took her time with it. "Then let me help you be wrong about it," she said. On the 61st day, she sent a message to Rias. It was encoded in the DAS format, using her personal key, and it was not short. It contained the logistics analysis she'd been building since day 12, the revised assessment of the zone's productive capacity and human capability, a detailed account of the supply depot operation, including the components of it that were going to be difficult to explain to anyone, a set of recommendations that were going to require 11 different people to agree on before anything happened, and a single sentence at the end that was not analysis. The sentence said, "This is not what anyone told us it was." She didn't know if anyone at the DAS would read it. She didn't know if Rias was still assigned to her case, or if her case had been quietly closed and she'd been categorized as one of the ones who didn't come back. She sent it anyway. She was going to keep sending them. That was the plan. On the 62nd day, Kethvaran asked her to attend a session with the zone's administrative council, a body she hadn't known existed, the records of its existence apparently buried in a way that the DAS had never found. It comprised 8 Keth administrators, and she discovered when she arrived 11 human representatives. She sat down with them. On the 78th day, she found her mother's name on a registry the zone kept. Her mother had been inside this zone for 6 years. She was alive. She was in the eastern section, in one of the housing blocks, and she worked in the food distribution system. She sat with this information for 1 full hour before she did anything about it. Then she walked to the eastern section. Her mother was shorter than she remembered, which was not how it was supposed to work, and her hair was entirely gray. And when she saw Mara, she made a sound that wasn't quite a word and put both hands on Mara's face. They stood there for a while. "You came over the wall," her mother said finally in German, not a question. "Yes." "How?" "They sent me," she said, "for reasons they thought they understood." She looked at her mother's face, the lines of it, the gray, the proof of years passing in a place that took its toll. "I'm going to get you out eventually. Not today, but eventually. That's a promise." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "You always made promises you intended to keep," she said. "Even as a child." "It usually worked out." Her mother made a sound that contained, very quietly, the shape of a laugh. On the 90th day, the end of the official trial period, Mara sat in the room with the better bed and the door that locked from the inside, and she waited. When Keth Varen arrived, she was reading the output of the synthesis nodes on a tablet Tobias had assembled for her from parts they weren't supposed to have. "The 90 days, he said. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You could return beyond the wall." "I know," she said again. "You are not going to." She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway with the amber light behind him, and that stillness he carried like a second carapace. And she thought about the first day she'd stood in his threshold room and looked at the walls before she looked at him. And she thought about all the days between then and this one, which were not simple, and were not easy, and were the most real days she'd spent in a long time. "Someone has to stay," she said. "All the things we're trying to build. Someone from the outside has to stay, or it's just administration." She set down the tablet. "Besides, my mother is here." He blinked, the deliberate expression blink. "You found her." Day 78. "You said nothing." "It wasn't your business yet." She stood up. "Now it is. I need her reclassified from auxiliary labor to technical advisory, because she spent 6 years learning the distribution system, and she knows it better than half your administrators." He looked at her for a moment that she had learned to read, by now, as the moment before a decision. "There is another word," he said, "in Keth, for what you do, for the specific thing, the act of staying inside the constraint and finding every crack in it and putting something useful in each crack." "What's the word?" He made a sound she couldn't replicate, which the translator rendered after a longer than usual pause as simply, "building." She thought about that. "We have the same word," she said. Outside the window, the zone went on. The market, the school, the maintenance hum, the synthesis nodes running at capacity. 82,000 people who had been told there was nothing on the other side of the wall, who had adapted and endured and learned the straight-ahead look, and underneath the look had kept building things, small things, real things, because that was what humans did when you gave them no other option, and sometimes when you gave them every option. She thought about what Keth Varen had said, 9 years of administration, and the moment he'd seen a school and been surprised. She thought, "We were always here, you just weren't looking." She looked at him now and said, "So, day 91, what's the problem?" He almost smiled. She thought he almost smiled. She was going to keep checking. "The water reclamation system in the North Sector," he said. "Right," she said. And she started building.